Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the fall of Samaria, 2 Kings chapter 17. As the chapter opens, verse 1, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, became king over Israel and Samaria and reigned 9 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. And notice there's evil that he does, and not quite as bad as some of the kings before him, but he's still not going to be a good king. In fact, that's been the case of all of the kings of the northern kingdom. We haven't really seen a good king yet who said, "Let's get rid of the golden calves and that old way of worshiping that was instituted by Jeroboam the first when the kingdom split." Now, what's interesting, notice in the illustration here, we found a seal, and it's the Hebrew writing on it is actually backwards. But when you take it and press it into clay, it makes a mirror image, and then you can read it in Hebrew and translate it. It says belonging to Abdi, the servant of Hoshea. So apparently, this was the scribe of Hoshea, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and we have actually found his seal. Verse 3, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him. This is Shalmaneser the fifth. There've been a few by that name, and so we number them so that we don't confuse them. Shalmaneser the fifth, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute, so that Israel now becomes a tributary, a vassal kingdom under Assyria, having to pay their taxes to the Assyrians. Verse 4, but the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt. Now, So apparently is his name, and we think that that might be a reference to the Libyan pharaoh, uh, Sorkhan the fourth. At this point in Egypt, Egypt was being ruled not by a dynasty of Egyptians, but by a dynasty of Libyans to the west of Egypt. But they were in Egypt, and Egypt and Assyria were about to go into a major conflict. And of course, little Israel is in the middle. And Hoshea somehow had been persuaded by negotiations or whatever. Maybe he didn't like how much taxes he was paying to the Assyrians. And so he goes into rebellion against Assyria. Notice, and had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. So the king of Assyria comes down, shut him up, and bound him in prison. Verse 5, then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. This siege is going to begin in the 720s. It will be a 3-year siege. Now, the writer of 2 Kings isn't going to mention this, but by the time that Samaria falls, Shalmaneser the fifth will not be alive. Actually, he will die while he's conducting the siege. And his younger brother, Sargon the second, will take over. We see that mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament, but that's not going to be mentioned here. Here we just read it's the king of Assyria. And so we mentioned his name earlier, but we're not going to continue to see Shalmaneser because he's not there when Israel finally falls. And so we have a 3-year siege against Israel, against Samaria. Samaria is the capital city of Israel. And when Samaria falls, Israel will cease to be a nation. And so we read verse 6, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. Remember, by the time this happens, it's no longer Shalmaneser the fifth. Now it's Sargon the second, but that's okay. He captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. They are taken and resettled. The population is forced to leave their homes. And the city of Samaria is going to stay in ruins. In fact, it's still in ruins to this day. What you're looking at are some of the excavated ruins of Samaria. There's not a city there anymore. The city has been lost and was never rebuilt. And the inhabitants, sometimes we talk about the 10 lost tribes. Well, they're not really lost. They knew where they were. They were resettled in the cities of the Medes, and eventually they would migrate to other places, so that you would have people from these tribes living in many different locations. Now you say, well, weren't they lost then? Well, they were scattered, but they weren't really lost because they still knew their tribal identity. Now, most Jewish people today cannot tell you from what tribe they came, but they could tell, back in even in New Testament times, there were those that were from some of those tribes that could still tell you where they were from, and some had returned to the land by that time, but they no longer had their tribal inheritance. Verse 7, now we have the theological reason as to why this takes place. I mean, I've given you the political and the geographical reasons, but now we see that this is from God. Now, this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God and had brought them up from the land of Egypt, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods and had walked in the custom of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel, which they had introduced. So God had brought them out of Egypt. And here they were going back to Egypt, making an alliance with Egypt. They were not supposed to do that. And so we have a series of indictments now against Israel. Verse 9, the secret thing, they're doing secret things that were not right. And you say, well, what secret things were they doing? I don't know. They were secret. But it goes on to say they were worshiping in high places. Verse 9, they were worshiping sacred pillars and the Asherim. These are pagan gods. You've got an example here on the left. They were burning incense on the high places. Verse 11, they served idols. Verse 12. Verse 13, yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. He continually sent prophets to them, warning them. Verse 14, however, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. There was fundamentally a lack of faith. Can I suggest that idolatry always has with it a lack of faith? They rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he made with their fathers. And notice, at the heart of this was a covenant. And when you enter into a covenant, you're saying, if I don't keep the terms of that covenant, may I be put to death. They had sworn a covenant with God, and now they broke it. They rejected it, which he made with their fathers, and his warnings with which he warned them. And they followed vanity, emptiness, vapor, air, and they became vain and empty, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord had commanded them not to do like them. They started acting like the other nations instead of acting as the set apart people, the priestly nation they were called to be. And we do the same thing when we start acting like others that are not like God's people. Verse 16, they forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served Baal. It went from bad to worse. First, they were using statues, these statues of golden calves. Remember that Aaron had done that back in the wilderness. But then Jeroboam, when the northern kingdom came along, he had set up 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and worship these, and then that led to worship of other pagan idols, and that led to worship of other pagan gods. Verse 17, then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. This was part of the pagan worship, where they would actually take one of their children and they would offer it to an idol, and there would be a place of burning there, and they would actually burn the child alive. And they would practice divination and enchantments and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. And it got worse and worse and worse until God finally, he vomited them out of the land. Verse 18 says, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. The 12 tribes, or actually it's 10 tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, are now going to be removed from the land. Judah, and of course Levi, and I guess you could count part of Benjamin that are in that Judah area. But they remain, but the others are now going to be scattered. Verse 19, also Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs which Israel had introduced. You say, well, why are they still in land? Well, they're not going to be. When we come to the end of 2 Kings, we're going to see them removed as well, but not yet, Verse 20, the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. Come to verse 22, the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. Remember, Jeroboam was the king of the northern kingdom, the first king of the northern kingdom that began this idolatry. And they did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he spoke through all his servants, the prophets. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria. Notice, until this day. At the time this is written, now I'm not saying this is necessarily written at that time, it's written a bit later. But at that time, Israel was still in captivity. Verse 24, the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon. Now, Babylon wasn't Assyria. Babylon was still in Mesopotamia, but it was south of Assyria. And also from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So not only did the Assyrians export, they took all of the Israelites that were living in the land and removed them from the area, and then brought other peoples that they were doing the same thing to those countries. They were relocating them to foreign lands and had them live in, notice, in Samaria, and they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. These are going to give rise, at least in part, to what we will eventually refer to as the Samaritans, because they were resettled in this area of Samaria. And they're not Jewish, or at least most of them are not, but we're going to find that gradually there's intermarriage, because when they deport people, they don't necessarily get every single individual. There's always a few that are left behind. And they're going to end up merging, where these two people groups will merge to form a hybrid, a new group, and they won't be Israel anymore. We're going to refer to them as Samaritans. And even when we get to the New Testament, we'll still see the Samaritans living to the north of what had been Judah. Now, notice what takes place as this new group is moved in. At the beginning of their living here, they did not fear the Lord. They'd been worshiping other gods. They'd never heard of God. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. One of the things you had back in that day, you don't have lions in Israel anymore, unless maybe it's in a zoo, but you did have lions native to that area, and suddenly they're coming in and killing some of these new settlers. Verse 26, so they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land, so he has sent lions among them, and behold, they kill them because they do not know the custom of the God of the land. They're saying, there's a God here in this land of Canaan, this land that had formerly been the land of Israel, and we don't know who they are, and apparently we've offended them, and now they've sent lions to gobble us up. Well, there's a response to that, verse 27. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you carried away into exile, and let him go and live there, and let him teach them the custom of the God of the land. And so there's a priest who's brought back, an Israelite priest who's brought back, and he's given a ministry of teaching the Samaritans about God. So one of the priests whom they had carried away into exile from Samaria came and lived at Bethel. Now, remember, Bethel had been one of those places where the golden calf had been set up. Now, there's no golden calf there anymore. But they taught them how they should fear the Lord. This becomes a point of evangelism, where they begin to learn about God and eventually about the scriptures. The Samaritans actually had what we call the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritan They didn't call it the Torah. I guess we can call it that. The Genesis through Deuteronomy, their own version. It was pretty much like the version that we have. There were a couple of places where they had made some typos, and they even added a verse in one place where it they put in the verse, "You shall worship the Lord here on Mount Gerizim," which was one of their mountains. That was never in the old Torah, but they had, aside from those minor changes, it's not really minor to change the word of God, but those small changes, they still had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That they had that, and here's where they begin to get it. Verse 29, but every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the houses of the high places, which the people of Samaria had made, every nation in their cities in which they lived. So yes, they begin to learn about God, but notice it's God and these other gods. So there is an evangelism, but it's a pre-evangelism that at best is turning the land into a pluralistic form of worship. And a pluralistic form of worship isn't all that good, because God wants you to worship him alone. Verse 41, so while these nations feared the Lord, they also served their idols, their children likewise, and their grandchildren, as their fathers did. So they do to this day. And as the book of 2 Kings will eventually come to a close, this Samaritan issue was still an issue. Yes, there had been sort of a pre-evangelism that had taken place, but there were still wrong beliefs. And when we come to the New Testament, and the picture here is of a place in that area of Samaria. In fact, it's at the old site of the original capital of the Northern Kingdom, Shechem. But by the time we get to the New Testament, it wasn't called Shechem anymore. It was called Sychar. And here at Sychar was a well that Jacob had dug, known as Jacob's well for that reason. And it was here that Jesus met a Samaritan woman and told her about himself and how he had come to fulfill the Old Testament prophecies, how he had come to be the faithful king, not the one that would worship a plurality of gods, but the one who would come to tell them about the God who was there and how he must be worshiped in spirit and in truth.